The cloud of foreign interference still hangs over Parliament. The chair of the committee that wrote that shocking intelligence report spoke to reporters one day after Green Party leader Elizabeth May gave her public assessment of the secret report. David McGuinty can't say too much. He's bound by secrecy laws, but he said today that focusing solely on unnamed members of Parliament is missing the bigger picture.
This review addresses federal, provincial, municipal politics. It addresses universities, boardroom tables, community associations, NGOs, right across the entirety of Canadian society. We've told the government to bring the political party leaders together and have an adult conversation about what we can do here. We've told the government to look at the Ethics Commissioner and the role of the Senate Ethics Commissioner to see whether we can tighten up or not tighten up responsibilities on foreign interference. We've told the government to actually conduct detailed briefings for parliamentarians so they can protect themselves and understand the difference between foreign influence and foreign interference. We've told the government to criminalize foreign interference in nomination processes. We've told the government to look at Elections Canada as a possible organization to oversee nominations and leadership campaigns. The stakes are huge. Our democracy is on the line. Our rule of law is on the line. Transnational repression is on the line. Our diaspora communities are on the line and being victimized. All of this is called out. It's a major clarion call for action.
There's a lot to discuss from that report, and here to help us with it today, Ward Elcock. He is the former director of the Canadian Security Intelligence Service, and he's here now in the studio. Ward, it's good to see you again.
Pleasure.
You heard what David McGuinty said there. He is limited in what he can say, but like Elizabeth May yesterday, he said, we're overwhelmingly focusing on the unnamed members of Parliament, and we're missing the bigger picture. How do you see that?
I think they guaranteed that by putting it in that with that level of detail. That was inevitable in the sort of fevered atmosphere we've had for the last year and a half on this subject, or longer. That was inevitable. I thought it was unwise at the time, and the further we go, the more unwise I think it was to say what they said. They could have alluded to issues that needed to be discussed without having gone into all these details.
Well, why was it so unwise to say that? I think the argument from Mr. McGuinty and other parts of his conversations today with reporters is that it was important to give Canadians a full sense of just what's happening here. And if there were members of Parliament compromised, the public should know.
But they've varied between the two. They didn't obviously go to the issue of giving people's names. That would have been improper, and I would have been surprised if they'd done that. But they gave such a level of detail, they could have avoided that and said that there were issues that needed to be discussed. I don't think Canadians are any better off as a result of the information they've got. And it's just created confusion and more unease about the whole system.
So this seems to be the motivation in what Elizabeth May did yesterday, right? She was the first opposition leader to get the security clearance, to get the briefing, and because she said she was worried that she was sitting in a House of Commons where people may have been disloyal to the country. And she gave this reassurance, saying she's still very worried about foreign interference, but she has confidence in everybody who is elected in the House of Commons that they are not the truly bad actors that are pointed to in the report. Does that in any way help Canadians reassure them? Like, how do you view that move by the Green leader?
I think it probably is helpful from the government's point of view, although the government made a similar, less pointed allusion when they released the report. I think it was the Minister of Public Safety. So that message has kind of been there on the table, and Miss May has gone further. Partly, I suspect, because she's an MP, not part of the government. The government's stuck, in a sense, as ministers. They're obliged to toe the line, and if they didn't toe the line on secrecy, the first thing the opposition would do would beat them over the head for not being adequately secure in their communications. So they're always going to be more careful in what they say than Miss May or any of the other party leaders.
Well, you mentioned that what she had to say sort of aligned with what Dominic LeBlanc had to say, but politics being what it is, and you've been on the show many times talking about this over the past year, it seems as if there's no willingness in some quarters to take the government at its word on this, given the way it's rolled out over the last little while. So we saw David McGuinty there talking about the need for an adult conversation to bring all the party leaders together. Are you getting any sense that that's where this is going to go?
I don't see it going in that direction at this point. Everybody, in a sense, has punted and turned it over, or said which should be turned over to Madam Justice Hogue. The problem is it's hard to see what Madam Justice Hogue will do with it. She's a judge herself. She's not going to name individuals. She could review the cases and come to a similar conclusion to Miss May, and maybe that would lower the temperature, but that's about as much as she can do. She can't name individuals. She can't reveal the information any more than Miss May can.
I wonder if Dick Fadden, who's often here with you in these conversations, he's made the point that there's just not enough time, right? Like, this is already a pretty ambitious mandate and a pretty limited time frame that the judge was given. I mean, could you even possibly throw all of this in there and expect any kind of a reasonable assessment from her in the time frame that's available?
It's not clear to me that couldn't be done. Miss May had I don't think she's not going to hold a full hearing, so it's not going to add to the process in that respect. Miss May saw the information relatively quickly and came to a conclusion relatively quickly. I'm not sure that Madam Justice Hogue is really going to find it all that much more difficult to do in terms of time, although her time is tight, I concede. But she can't do a full process anyway, so it's got to be a kind of quick and dirty to some extent.
So where does that leave us, though? Because Elizabeth May and Mike Morse, the other Green Party MP, they were the only MPs to vote against the idea of sending it to the inquiry, recognizing the limitations on the judge, but also saying that this is really a problem for Parliament to solve, which is something we've heard from other people like Philippe Lagacé, who studies this. Where do you think this needs to go at this point, given sort of the public focus on it and the political frenzy around it?
It is something that, and I think Dick Fadden alluded to that at some point, that this is something Parliament could settle. And it may be that there is a way for Parliament to do that. I guess the reality of, like most national security discussions in this country, it's not really carried out in an intellectual or grown-up fashion. So it's highly unlikely that that's going to happen. And the parties will continue to, particularly the opposition parties, will continue to take their position to simply beat the government over the head.
So I go back to the clip of David McGuinty we opened with, and he is a Liberal MP, and he was going in the Liberal caucus when he said this, but he's the chair of a committee that has New Democrats, that has Conservatives on it, and Senators. So he is speaking, this report is their consensus voice. And they've all called for that, like an adult, intelligent approach to this. And some leaders are getting to the point where they're going to get briefed so they can read it, get the clearance to read the report. Mr. Poilievre has said he's not willing to do that. Can Parliament fix this if not everybody is fully informed on what's in there so that they're operating from a common set of facts?
If it depends to some extent, I suppose, on where the MPs actually, which caucus they fall into. If there is nobody in Mr. Poilievre's caucus, and I don't know the answer to that question, then it may be possible to settle it without Mr. Poilievre's participation. But if there are if there's a Conservative member in that involved in this, or previous, or whatever, then if he's not in it, then I don't see how you come to a conclusion that really takes us anywhere useful. Right.
Well, the Conservative leadership races were implicated as China and India trying to meddle in them the last 2 times. So that's not a thing that is specific to Parliament, but it is something the political parties need to do.
But that doesn't mean that the Conservative leadership involved particular MPs who were participating with foreign governments. So whether those two things are the same issue or different issues is not entirely clear to us.
We've been talking about this for about 15, 16, 18 months now to this point. And we had this report come out from NSICOP, which repeated a lot of warnings in earlier reports that McGuinty rightly pointed out that the media kind of ignored, with this exception of some national security reporters like Kat Tunney, who works here with us. But do you get the sense there's a real urgency to deal with it in Parliament? This is what I wonder about. I read this most recent report. It got me alarmed on the full state of things, that this would be the consensus view of a multi-party committee. And now it seems that they're shipping it off to the inquiry, and there doesn't seem to be a real move inside Parliament to deal with things. I mean, what's your sense of it?
The truth is, in my view, frankly, that if you're talking about foreign interference, probably the least crucial part of foreign interference is whether or not any MPs have been involved in improper discussions with foreign governments. I'm not saying that's unimportant. I'm not saying it's an issue that shouldn't be dealt with, but I would say, frankly, the foreign interference in terms of the pressure put on individual Canadian citizens from whatever origin by foreign governments and harassment by other governments of Canadian citizens is ultimately far more insidious and far more oppressive than what appear to be relatively innocuous. I'm not saying they're utterly unimportant, but appear to be, if we believe Ms. May, relatively innocuous, probably not things you should do, and you ought to get educated, but not so serious that anybody necessarily ought to be charged with a criminal offense or whatever. Well,
this brings me back to, I guess, where we started, because McGuinty kind of said that we're missing the bigger picture. And he talked about every level of the political process, provincial governments, municipal governments, NGOs, media, boardrooms, universities, all have been affected to some degree. And you know, we're guilty of this, I guess, as journalists, focusing on what's happening here on Parliament Hill. But the problem is so much larger than that, and that is not where the conversation and focus and the solution search has gone.
No, it hasn't. Some of the things you described, a registry will help, so that's in process, and ultimately that will come through, I assume, although people are raising some issues about the registry, or concerns about the registry. But I think that's a useful thing to do. There will be other things to do, but the reality is it's going to be very hard. It's very hard to see how one resolves the specific problem that was created by the Elcock report, which I think, to go back to what I said at the beginning, probably put too much detail in on a relatively less important issue, not one that doesn't need to be addressed, but by doing that, they covered everything else with this one particular issue, which seems to have been overblown entirely.
So on that point, just as a final question, Jagmeet Singh is going to read the report tomorrow. Mr. Blanchette is going to get briefed in at some point. He started that process, it seems. What do you want to see next from Parliament, or what are you watching for next from Parliament to see if this is going to move in a direction to sort of get to the root of the larger challenges?
Well, ultimately, if they're going to deal with the issue this has created in the public, they're really going to have to come to some conclusion collectively about what they do about the various individuals who have been described as having carried out activities with foreign governments at some level. None of it appears to rise to the level of, I mean, people have tossed around the word treason, which has seemed to me from the beginning to be inappropriate, but people have tossed that around. That clearly is not where we are. That clearly is not the problem. Is there a problem that some MPs are too cavalier in dealing with foreign governments and too incautious in dealing with foreign governments, too uneducated in dealing with foreign governments? Yes. So education is one part. Another part is, frankly, finding a way collectively among parliamentarians in the process of the House, I suspect, to deal with individuals who are seen to have carried out these activities. And it may ultimately be that it may simply be for each party to deal with individuals within their own party.
Ward Elcock, former CSIS director, always appreciate the time. Thank you, sir.
A pleasure.
The chair of the committee responsible for that shocking intelligence report that has dominated conversation on Parliament Hill spoke to reporters today. While David McGuinty can't say much because of secrecy laws, he did say partisanship on the issue of foreign interference needs to be put aside.
We need to park the partisanship at the door, and that's why I think it might be a very productive thing to have all leaders come together and have this conversation and look at some of the recommendations we put forward and consider whether Elections Canada should play a role. We have pointed out that nominations and leaderships are a weak link in the system. We'd like to see that tightened up.
One of those weak links mentioned in the report are allegations that China and India interfered in the Conservative Party leadership race, something NDP leader Jagmeet Singh says he would want to know about if it happened in his party.
If any suggestion arose that my leadership race was interfered with in that manner, I would want to know. It is outrageous to me and deeply irresponsible that Pierre Poilievre has no desire to read the report, to learn about what happened concerning the way he was selected as leader.
All right, it's time to bring in the Power Panel to talk about this. Jordan Leichnitz is a former NDP strategist. Tim Powers is a former strategist for Conservative parties. Sherelle Evelyn is the managing editor of The Hill Times, and Jonathan Kalis is a former Quebec advisor to Prime Minister Justin Trudeau. Hello, gang. I'm sure no one here has been read in on the NSI cop, right? No one's seen the non-redacted version?
Not this week, anyway.
Tim, we're getting people talking about it publicly. Elizabeth May came out, tried to reassure Canadians there's no one in the Parliament right now that could, be considered a traitor based on things, but she also said we're kind of missing the bigger picture by focusing just on unnamed MPs. David McGuinty said the same thing today. Where are we a week after this?
I find myself in the strange place of agreeing with Elizabeth that we are, I think, missing the bigger picture. I think there is a balance to be struck, and to be fair to her, I guess she tried to do that in her way yesterday by revealing what she could reveal about. Finally, we know that few is apparently 5 current.
Less than 5.
Less than 5. Well, 5 if you count the former parliamentarian. Mm-hmm. That really should be the government doing all of that. If Elizabeth May can speak to it the way that she did, why can't the government do that? I think it's still a bit convenient to push it all off on the opposition. Mr. Singh, I don't think was particularly helpful. I get why he's making the point that Mr. Poilievre should read it, but then throwing in as he does, well, we saw how he got elected. That's what David McGuinty is saying we shouldn't do. Pierre Poilievre's rationale is what it is. People will accept it or they won't accept it. I think that is also a bit of a distraction from the issue. And maybe the suggestion that Poilievre and others are making, it's not just Poilievre, that the justice that's running the Commission of Inquiry look into this and find a way to blend these two together is the way forward. But I think, as we're seeing, we can't just keep pushing this away,
Jordan, it seems that this is something Parliament's got to deal with, right? Like, the judge has a lot on her plate. She's already got to be, and she can't name names and find findings of guilt, without due process any more than the NSI cop could.
Well, and also any process that just pushes this months down the road is going to do nothing to dispel the cloud that's hanging over Parliament Hill right now. So I think that's another issue with the idea of tossing it over to the justice, because it's not going to solve what is fundamentally a problem that I think begins and ends within parties, around nomination processes, and frankly with leaders who have to make some decisions about what's going on inside of their parties. And I think that we're seeing a lot of circling around that. Singh was out and he was pretty clear about what he would do if he sees something there. But there really hasn't been that level of clarity either from Pierre Poilievre, because he hasn't wanted to be read in and so hasn't made any conclusions about what he would do with that information, because he isn't seeking to get it. And we don't know what Mr. Trudeau is doing either, because he's had that information in his capacity as Prime Minister, but we don't know if there's been any involvement of the Liberal Party or any decisions that have been made with that information. And so I think that it's really, for me, all of this is driving back for the need to parties to get their hands around this and leaders to think carefully about what the implications are for their own caucuses.
Well, so Jono, on that, nominations, leadership races all come up in this. We got a statement today from the Liberal Party not really saying they're going to change the nomination rules, despite this being exposed as an area of vulnerability. I mean, what do you make of the overall political response when you've got McGuinty and May saying, set partisanship aside and deal with the issue?
Set partisanship aside. Sorry, but that's just it's really pretty damn naive. It's not going to happen. They all live in the real world. They're both members of Parliament, and they say that. And so I'm not. We need to find out about this. I'm a Canadian. I'm always looking for the scoop. I want to hear what's happening. So I want to know. But, it's been a week now. I haven't heard anybody actually give me an idea that I can get my head around and say, you know what, that's a good idea. I haven't heard it. So maybe, the 5 of us can figure it out today. But, what is the solution? And for the committee, for NSI COP to come up with this data dump, they throw it out there. There's allegations. There aren't names. Did they not see this coming? And so they just throw it out there. And then McGuinty then says today, well, let's do this in a non-partisan way. Where is he? So I don't understand what he expected to happen when they threw this out there. So I'm not any smarter than all these other people that I have some magic solution. But just revealing the names and not actually understanding what is evidence and what is just little bits of intelligence, that's not a solution. And then there's allies and where the intelligence came from, that's a problem. But we can't keep this secret. People are entitled to know, so that's not a solution to just sit on it. So, you know, we're just sitting there in this conundrum, but no one's actually come up with a solution. Get into the partisanship, and we've seen it on all sides. But what's the solution? I'm not hearing any.
Cheryl, I got a crazy idea. All the party leaders get briefed and meet together and come up with a plan to protect Canadian elections. That seems like something party leaders would want to do. I don't know.
Well, it hasn't. I don't know if the past has given us any indication that is something that they'd want to do. And, you know, just to disagree a little bit with Jonathan, I mean, the Elcock report, it's didn't just say, oh, by the way, there's some people that, you know, might have done some bad things. It was a whole, you know, 90-something page report where they did lay out, you know, some recommendations, and they did offer some solutions and things.
A litany of inaction. A
litany of inaction. There are so many things that the government has been told and briefed on and warned about, and they've highlighted in their report a pattern of here are all the times the government didn't act or took years to get something done with this, and in the meantime we've had more elections and things and there was still interference and all of those things. But some of the main things are that people don't seem to want to look beyond the political scorecard, right? They don't want to do something that might potentially disadvantage them if they happen to act on it and do, I don't know, the quote-unquote right thing, because their opponents are not going to change anything, you know, about their nomination races or any of those things. All of these things that people have said, these are real problems. So by choosing to remain ignorant of the facts, by choosing to not get briefed on the report, it's not just about the names in the report. I think it's important, but also a little bit of a red herring.
But sorry.
You done?
No.
You done?
Well, let me just say.
Let her finish, and then
let me just say. It's so there are. It's not just about the names, because it's a whole democratic system, and there are things that as party leaders, they should want to know where the holes are in the system that they could plug within their own parties, even outside of the House of Commons.
Okay, Tim, quickly.
I was just going to pick up where Cheryl was skating there, putting the puck in the net, of course. I know you like sports references. What I found fascinating about May's comments was the acknowledgement from her, anyway, that Canada was a soft target. To Cheryl's point, so what does that mean? How vulnerable are we? Because that's part of how you get at bringing forward a solution. Because are we so soft that every key areas are malleable? Are we soft in one area? Can we brush up, bone up there, improve there?
But NSI Cop's been saying this for years. Going back to the India trip, where they did an assessment of what happened with the Prime Minister's trip to India. They basically said there are no consequences. There's no foreign registry. We haven't criminalized certain behavior. Even now, you can mess around in a nomination, and until the legislation before Parliament passes now, it's not a criminal offense.
But as you would assess in anywhere else, what's the materiality, right? Like, what is the impact going to be? So nominations is an interesting one. Are we suggesting, to get very conspiratorial for a moment, we're electing Manchurian candidates all over the place who are going to come together? Maybe I don't think we are. I don't think we are ever being near that, but what kind of buffers do we need to address it? Is it 1 or 2 MPs? That's still serious, but it's not as serious as 320 being targets. I think part of the discussion starts with where do we fix things beyond NISCOP, and party leaders can involve themselves in that.
Right.
And can I just say one thing you guys said about Poilievre, to be fair? I just did hear him this morning on an interview with CFRA Radio saying that if somebody in his caucus were found to wittingly be acting with a foreign power, that they would be kicked out.
Yeah, but there's context on that.
Right?
There's context on that. It's not him reading the information and coming to that conclusion.
Sure.
It's if Justice Ode delivers a finding, and we don't even know if she's going to do it. So if she convicts them, he'll act. But we're a long way from that.
That's a really, I think, kicking the can down the road. And I just want to come back to, I think, something Jonathan raised about the committee and putting out this report and what did they think would happen. Well, I think this is actually exactly what they expected would happen. And if you look at the report and the recommendations, to me, this was the committee raising the alarm within the scope of what they were able to do with their powers to say that we do have a problem here. And I think that the scope of the problem, whether it's 5 people or 300, it's still like this cloud can't be allowed to stay. It is a huge issue, and it's a huge leadership issue. And I think that when it comes to the question of nominations, there are weaknesses. Like, we know that there are weaknesses in these processes, and there's really material things that could be discussed. And I know that Mr. McGuinty was out talking about getting Elections Canada involved in nominations today. I'm pretty sure that's the last thing any party would want to have happen. But look, like, each party does nominations differently. Yep. But I think we can all agree that there's a standard that they should hold to around protecting democratic institutions, and parties are part of our democratic institutions. And so if, for example, international students are being allowed to vote, what are the rules around that? That's not the case in every party. Like, these are some of the things that could be looked at concretely. But I do, just to go back to Mr. Poilievre, because I think, to me, it's really surprising. Like, he has not really gotten his hands on this issue, and he wants to be prime minister. He wants to be prime minister, and this issue is going nowhere. And so I think there's an opportunity for him to actually get on top of this, to be seen, to be active and not reactive, and not just trying to use this as a wedge, but actually to do something kind of for the good of the country. And he's missing that opportunity right now.
Well, Jono, I mean, I know people may not want Elections Canada involved in nominations, but, you know, the Chinese consulate in Toronto is apparently involved in nominations, and maybe Elections Canada might be a more benign entity. But, you know, we talked about this on the show last night. I got a phone call when I got off the air from a well-connected federal conservative who doesn't understand their position, because they basically said the good politics and the good policy are the same here.
Yes.
Get informed and attack it head on. Don't outsource your response.
Well, if you want me to comment on why Pierre Poilievre has decided not
why?
to do this,
Why do you think?
This isn't new, but I agree with you. It would be one of the things that he's clearly lacking, that people still are unsure about, is he prime ministerial? Can he rise above the fray, show the maturity, the statesmanship? And playing this game demonstrates that he's not ready. Sorry to steal that cliche, but you know,
I see an ad coming.
We've heard that before, right?
It popped in my head, but that he's avoiding this, and you know, again, my cynicism about keeping this, you know, away from partisanship. I mean, yes, this is the first example. I think all the parties, to varying degrees, are playing partisan games, or at least trying to protect themselves from, you know, political interference making them look bad. And so it actually is deflecting from the bigger issue, which is whether there are 4 or 5 MPs, current or former, or there are other government institutions being attacked. But it's bigger than that. It's media, it's boardrooms, it was all the other sort of areas where they were talking about, and no one's talking about those things. So no one's in solution mode. Now everybody's sort of trying to deflect and say, well, it's them. It's somebody else's fault. So, okay, Elections Canada getting involved in you know, party operations. No one really wants that, but some standardization might be a nice idea. And, you know, I think James Moore's been on this for months. Yeah. Maybe it should be that citizens of 18 years old and older should be the ones that are able to vote and no one else. It's not a crazy idea. I mean,
political parties want to be exempt from privacy laws. They want to be exempt from Elections Canada. I mean, they set the laws and they don't want to live by the laws. It's a conversation for another day. But Sherelle, just as a final point on this, Jagmeet Singh is either reading this report right now or is finished reading it by now, and he's going to speak tomorrow. I mean, where do you think this goes if the NDP leader comes out and if he agrees with Ms. May or has a totally different version of interpretation of what he read?
Yeah, well, that's really interesting. If he comes out and says something interesting, something different from what Elizabeth May said, where
kick someone out of caucus,
kick somebody out of, I will imagine. You know, she came out and said, I am not, she said there is a problem, but she's not concerned, you know, that, you know, she needs to be looking over her shoulder.
Worried about the issue, but not her colleagues, right? Is basically it.
So if Mr. Singh comes out and says, no, man, this is a real issue and we've got to clamp down on it, I think that's going to take it somewhere else. They did have similar responses the last time they both had secret briefings. So I don't know if I'm necessarily expecting them to, you know, diverge, but also Mr. Blanchet is supposed to be now, you know, now that Elizabeth May, you know, took a woman to get things, the ball rolling, now that Elizabeth May has done it and he saw what she did, Mr. Blanchet says he's going to go get briefed, and that will just leave Mr. Poilievre as kind of the outlier there. But if they all kind of say the same thing, then that's really interesting. But it was a block motion to get the issue punted over to the Hague Commission. So I don't know if they'll be.
Yeah, well, it was interesting to see the Bloc coming out and saying they were acting in the best interest of Canada and, and finding a compromise solution, but we still haven't heard from the inquiry yet exactly how that's going to go.